Hello and welcome to this webinar, Get Your CEP Questions Answered, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. I'm Steve Hayward, FRAC's Senior Communications Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 60 minutes. However, we're recording the presentation and we'll send the recording and slides in a follow-up email, so you'll still receive all the information even if you have to hop off. At the end of the presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the bottom right of the WebEx screen. With that, I'll pass it off to Allison Perez, Child Nutrition Policy Analyst at FRAC.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on getting your CEP questions answered. My name is Allison Perez, and I am a Child Nutrition Policy Analyst with the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. We know how busy everyone is, and we really appreciate your interest and your participation. We're hosting this webinar because community eligibility adoption season is upon us. And in light of the ending summer waivers and with deadlines approaching in some states, we wanted to make sure that everyone has the tools they need to make a decision about whether community eligibility makes sense for your schools. And within this current landscape, we think it's more important than ever that high-need schools and districts consider community eligibility as an option to continue serving free breakfast and lunches to all students next school year. The goal of this webinar is to discuss the basics of community eligibility, to go over FRAC's resources, and to hear from a wide variety of stakeholders who will answer your questions on community eligibility. Next slide. We have a full agenda today, so I thought I would take a moment to go over the schedule for the webinar. So once I'm done going over the agenda, I'll give a brief introduction to community eligibility and FRAC's various resources, and then I'll introduce our panel of experts who will be able to answer questions you have about community eligibility. We are lucky today to have experts online from a variety of places, including USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, the Department of Education, a school nutrition director, and a state advocate. We'll start with a couple of pre-submitted questions that our presenters have prepared responses for, and then we'll open up to live Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function to the right of the WebEx window, as Stephen was saying. Please do not use the chat to submit your questions. We will not be moderating the chat window, but we will be looking at the Q&A function. I will be moderating the question and answer session, and I will see your questions and pose them to the panel for folks to answer. Next slide. So the community eligibility provision is a provision within the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program that allows high poverty schools to provide free breakfast and lunch to all students without collecting applications. Schools are reimbursed based on a proportion of the low-income children in their school district or school. Eligibility and reimbursement is based on the percentage of identified students, also known as the ISP. And any district can use this option if at least one of its schools has a 40% or more students certified for 3 meals without an application, which are known as identified students. Identified students include those who are in 2 categories. Children who are directly certified for free school meals through data matching because their households receive SNAP, TANF, or FDPRA benefits, or in some states, Medicaid. Children who are certified for free meals without application because they are homeless, migrant, enrolled in Head Start, or in foster care. This percentage is then multiplied by a factor of 1.6, as outlined by federal statute, in order to determine the percentage of meals which will be reimbursed at the free federal rate, with the school making up the cost for the rest of the meals served. As USDA's summer waivers expire on June 30th, 2022, adopting CEP is a great way for qualifying schools and districts to continue serving healthy meals at no charge to students next school year. Next slide. Despite uncertainty and challenges of the pandemic, we continue to see some growth in CEP for the 2021-22 school year. And I'm happy to share some of the results, top line results and data that we have from our annual CEP report that is forthcoming and should be released next week. In the 2021-2022 school year, 16.2 million students were served in over 5,500 school districts across the country at over 33,000 schools, which is nearly 1 of 3 schools nationwide, and nearly 3/4 of eligible schools are participating in community eligibility. Next slide. Districts can participate in community eligibility in a variety of ways. As I said earlier, schools with an identified student percentage of at least 40% can participate individually. Schools within a district can also be grouped together in any way, as long as the group has a combined ISP of at least 40% or more, and there's no limit to the number of groups that a district can have. Finally, school districts can participate as a single group if they would like, as long as the district-wide identified student percentage is at least 40%. Grouping allows districts to optimize their identified student percentages to ensure that they can get the highest level of federal reimbursement for all schools participating. Next slide. I briefly wanted to go over some details on what community eligibility will look like for next school year. And as many of you are already aware, USDA extended key waiver flexibility for community eligibility for this current school year, the 2021-2022 school year, giving states, districts, and schools more time and flexibility to adopt CEP for the school year. And because this nationwide waiver authority is set to expire on June 30th, they're not able to extend nationwide waivers to extend deadlines for community eligibility for the entire country. But they have expressed that they are granting states individual waivers to extend these deadlines. And as of a few weeks ago, there are as many as 30 states, and I'm sure that number has gone up since then, that have been granting deadline extension waivers for the upcoming school year. So please check with your state agency to determine when your state's community eligibility deadlines are. If your state does choose to apply for the deadline extension, rather than having until May 1st to report the list of eligible schools and districts, they'll have until June 30th. And rather than schools and districts adopting by June 30th, they can have up until the September 30th. And many states are also choosing to make that deadline before the school year starts. So definitely check in with your state agency as to when your deadlines are for your state. Next slide. Now I just wanted to briefly discuss some of FRAC's resources on community eligibility, starting with our community eligibility webpage, which on this page we have links to all of the resources that I'm about to discuss, and it's accessible at frac.org/community eligibility, as you can see on the screen. Next slide. Next, we have our community eligibility database, where we house the list of all schools eligible for and currently adopting community eligibility in both a web-based platform, like you can see on your screen, and as a downloadable Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. The list currently available was updated recently to include all 50 states and the District of Columbia for the current school year. Next slide. Another key tool that we have is our grouping tool. As I talked about earlier, school districts can group multiple schools together to maximize ISP and federal reimbursements across districts. And so to facilitate this, FRAC has designed this tool that allows districts to upload a list of schools, which should include information about ISP and enrollment, so that you can devise optimal groupings to achieve targeted ISPs and maximize reimbursement. Next slide. We also have a series of financial calculators to help schools and districts calculate how to make community eligibility best work for their operations. We have 3 calculators: a break-even calculator, a district level calculator, and a more granular school level calculator. The break-even calculator allows schools to use their ISP and basic information about school nutrition operations to calculate the participation needed to break even in breakfast, lunch, supper, and/or snack. The district level calculator allows districts to dig a little bit deeper to look at expenses and revenue under community eligibility by school type and compare implementing community eligibility to current operations. Both of these are available as web-based calculators and as downloadable Excel spreadsheets, and the more granular school level calculator is only available as a downloadable spreadsheet. Next slide. All of these resources and more from FAC on community eligibility can be found at links on this slide, including our website, our most recent report on community eligibility from the previous school year. Our upcoming report, like I said, is going to be released next week. We have resources on making community eligibility work with lower ISPs, strategies on making it work, our CEP database, our one-pager on Medicaid direct certification demonstration project, our guides to direct certification, and our grouping tools and financial calculator. Next slide. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves. First, we have our friends from USDA. So Jeff, Deborah, Jennifer, and Latasha, if you each want to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure, I can go ahead and kick it off. My name is Jeff Warner. I've been working in the school meals branch in the national office for USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, located in Alexandria, Virginia, for just about 3 years. Been working on CEP for just a little over 1.5 years, so still a little bit new to me, full disclaimer. I'm going to absolutely do my best to address all of your questions adequately, but there may be some that we won't be able to answer this time. So I'll go ahead and apologize for that in advance, but We do have some CEP experts from USDA here, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Deborah Udding, who works alongside me in the national office.
Hi, my name is Deborah Udding, I don't know who the CP experts are, Jeff, but I work with Jeff and the team. And I've worked at FNS for quite a number of years in WIC and in SNAP, and now in child nutrition in the school's policy branch. And I work on a number of different issues, but CP is definitely one of them. And we're in the policy branch. And I'll pass it on to Jennifer.
Thank you, Deborah. My name is Jennifer Odie. I'm with the Mountain Plains office in Denver, Colorado. So we support 8 states in our area. So shout out to anybody in our region who's on the webinar, and welcome to everybody. I have about going on 16 years of experience in the school nutrition program, 6 at FNS, and a little over 6, and then 9 at a state level. I've been working at with CEP for a long time, but there are always new questions that come up. So we're happy to be here today to help everyone out. I will turn it over to another regional person, Deborah, in our Southeast region.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Tarver, and I work in the Southeast Regional Office. We also serve 8 states in our region. I've been with the School Nutrition Branch for 6 years. I've been with FNS for 8 years. Prior to coming to FNS, I did work in the state agency, and I did work with the SNAP direct certification project. So I am so happy to be with you today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Latasha Beasley. I'm a program analyst with our school's policy branch, and I'll just be helping a little bit today in the background. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, Latasha, and thank you all so much for being here. We also are really honored to have some friends from the U.S. Department of Education. Todd and Fatima, if you would like to introduce yourselves.
I can go ahead and get us started. I don't see Todd yet. My name is Fatima Abdullahi. I'm with the United States Department of Education. Specifically, I work with the Title I Part A program, and I've done a lot of work recently because working with USDA and implementing CEP with schools that implement Title I. So excited to be here and answer any questions, and I'll pass it over to Todd.
Thanks, Fatima. Just to echo what Fatima said, it's really good to be with you all today. We're really glad to have the opportunity to talk about how, like we've done for a number of years, Title I can work well with CEP and so forth. So again, name is Todd Stevenson. Work with Fatima from Ed's Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and glad to have the chance to be with you all today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you. Now we also have the honor of having a school nutrition director who implements CEP, Robert Shaheen from New Bedford Public Schools in Massachusetts. Rob, if you want to introduce yourself briefly.
Thanks, Allison. Yep, my name is Rob Shaheen, so I'm the food service director in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Our district has over 13,000 students, and our ISP is over 62.5%. So we're at 100% of the reimbursement. I've been here for 4 years. Previous, I worked in another school district as a director called the Wareham Public Schools, which only had 2,400 students. And the ISP there was about 50%, which is about 80 or so percent of the reimbursement. And I was able to make it work in both districts and not have any debt. So it worked out well.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. And then we also have Maureen Fitzgerald, who's an excellent advocate from the state of Wisconsin, joining us. Maureen, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Allison. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Maureen Fitzgerald. I'm with Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin. I have been an anti-hunger advocate for over a decade. I think I worked in CEP the first year it rolled out nationwide. And I can personally attest to how fantastic FRAC's resources are to help advocates across the country as you're getting started in CEP, and even if you've been doing it a while, to use those calculators are really a game changer.
Awesome. Well, that's something that we always really love to hear. Well, I know that with our registration form, we did ask people if they had any questions that they would like to submit beforehand, and we did get a couple of questions. One of which was about grouping and making financial things and things like that. So I will pass it off to my friends at USDA with their slides that they prepared to talk about the reimbursement rates and claiming percentages and things like
that. Okay. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and go over this. So this is the calculation. I wasn't sure if people actually knew how to calculate their identified student percentage. So I started at that point, and then what happens is you take your actual identified students through direct certification. It can be, direct certification through SNAP, but also other categorical eligibility programs like homeless and FDIPR and different programs that are also entitlement and needs-based programs. And you divide that by the enrolled students, and you multiply that by 100 to get to your ISP, or your identified student percentage. And then, okay, was the question about grouping or I guess there were two different questions. One was just calculating how to calculate your percentages, and the other was for grouping. Was this one for grouping?
So we can talk about both. So the next slide is talking about grouping, so we can move on to talk about grouping if you like.
Right, and then well, let's just finish this then. So after you take your ISP, multiply that by 1.6, and that gives you your claiming percentage for what you would get reimbursed at the free rate. And so that free rate, if you have a claiming percentage of 62.5%, then you can get all of your meals claimed at the free rate. And to determine then your paid rate, because I think the question was, how do I determine my paid rate? You would take your either school meals served times the claiming percentage, and that would equal, like I said, your free rate. And then what you do is you would subtract your reimbursed meals at the free rate from the total meals served, and that would give you the meals reimbursed at the paid rate. So it's a calculation. It's a calculation, and you can also, you can use to determine your claiming percentages and your grouping claiming percentages. You can also use our estimator tool to figure out your eligibility in terms of financial, how to get started. If you're starting out with CEP, whether or not it would be financially viable. And we have an estimator tool on our website, which we can link to in the chat. I think somebody can link that because we have it in our document, but we'll make sure to put that link in there.
Also, feel free to share it with us and we can send it along to everyone at the end of the webinar with the follow-up materials.
Okay.
All right, well, that was very helpful. Next slide.
So Jennifer, you're really good at the grouping. Do you want to talk about grouping?
Sure, I can talk about grouping. So there's a few different ways that an SFA can choose to figure out its CEP groups. So there can be single schools that elect, and they're just that school. That school is going to have an ISP, and they're going to run with CEP. The entire district can also have an ISP for all of the schools in the district, or there can be certain schools that are grouped together. So let's look at this slide. So in this SFA, there's school 1, 2, and 3, and the second column in there tells the number of identified students in each school. So the total of all of those students is 248 in the gray at the bottom. And then, and again, those are what we were talking about that Deborah mentioned. Those are your, your SNAP kids, anybody who's directly certified, not via application, would be considered an identified student. And then you divide that over the total enrollment. And since this is a group, you do all of your identified students added together, and then you add up all of the enrolled students, and those are all the kids who have access to the meal programs. So it ends up being 248 divided by 420, and that's a 59% ISP. So that is what all of these schools would use for their ISP. And then, of course, that would be multiplied by 1.6 to get their free claiming percentage. And so what's nice, and Allison had mentioned this too, is there's different ways to figure out to maximize really your group. So if you have a lower percentage school, you can group it with a higher percentage school so that they could qualify. It might bring down the overall ISP, but in this case, if the ISP were brought down a little bit, it still wouldn't hurt the district too much because they do have a fairly high ISP, which would end up with a fairly high free claiming percentage. So we were talking about how CEP is fun. It's kind of fun to group all the schools together and figure out how you can maximize your percentage.
And I think what's great about this example right here is you can see that school 2 at 38%, it technically wouldn't normally qualify for CEP, but once you group it with the other 2 schools which have higher ISPs, they and they're participating with the group-wide ISP at 59%, that means that they can take advantage of community eligibility, and the kids at that school will be able to receive free meals, which is really great. So thank you all so much for those really helpful answers. I know we also had a submitted question around Title I, so I will pass it off to Todd and Fatima for their couple of slides that they've submitted.
Thank you so much, Allison. And I'll just take a moment to go through the slides, and then we can open up the floor for questions and that one question that you just said. And just sort of to echo both Deborah and things that you said earlier, Allison, the purpose of these slides, and you can move on to the next one too, is sort of just to discuss, you can move on to the next one too, that's just the presenters, me and Todd, is to discuss how Ed Title I Part A program, and for the purpose of the slides, we'll say Title I intersect with the National School Lunch Program, and then also how it relates to the CEP component that many schools are considering as the USDA waivers expire. As a general overview, assuming most people know, but if you don't, Title I's purpose is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. And to help achieve these purposes, there are some instances in which a state or local educational agency, or LEA for short, needs to use student level poverty data. And often that data comes from the National School Lunch Program, or free and reduced price lunch, and our most readily available poverty data source, or even the only poverty data source available to a state or an LEA. So therefore, that's where we see a lot of the intersections that happen between Title I and then with the school lunch program and CEP. But this should not be a barrier in any way for schools that are considering participating in CEP. And from our perspective at the department, we think that Title I can operate just as well in LEAs with CEP schools as it does in LEAs without. So operating a successful Title I program can be done for schools who are considering participating in CEP. So I'll just go over quickly a couple of more of these connections, specifically to determining within district allocations for Title I and using CEP, is that most, like I said, most LEAs use NSLP data to determine which of their schools are eligible to receive Title I funds and how much eligible schools receive. And we call this process informally Title I ranking and serving. And the way that this looks like is an LEA would need to know what poverty percentage in each school is, and then that would help them inform the LEA of which schools are eligible and exactly how much money that eligible school will receive. And like I said, that school lunch data is primarily the option that schools are using to measure the school level poverty. But they aren't limited to that. Schools can also use TANF, Medicaid, census level, or a combination of sources to determine school eligibility, but we do recognize that CEP data are a huge part of the school lunch data. There are additional intersections that we outline on the slide here that may occur between Title I and CEP, such as within state Title I allocations to LEAs in some instances, the implementation by an LEA providing Title I services to eligible private school students, and then also the use of CEP data to identify children in the economically disadvantaged subgroup for Title I accountability purposes. We can move to the next, our last slide here. And here we just present to you guys a couple of our resources that will be really helpful in terms of specifically the first document released in February of this year about within district Title I allocations. And this includes an entire section on CEP and pulls together information on what was previously in multiple documents and describes the requirements and options that an LA has in distributing Title I funds to school. And this also includes examples of the choice not to use CEP or any other national school lunch program data for this purpose and instead use other authorized poverty data, like I said before, Medicaid for this purpose. The second document, updated this past January, provides relevant information to states and LEAs to use NSLP, National School Lunch Program data to implement Title I and several other ESDA programs during this year and next year in light of incomplete data due to the nationwide waivers that are in effect through the end of this month. And the third document outlines Title I services to eligible private school children and includes information on the use in some instances of the NSLP data to determine the number of private school children from low-income families, which is the basis for how much of an LEA Title I allocation the LEA must use to provide equitable services. And the final document from 2015 just includes information on all the topics, including within state Title I allocations and accountability. So a lot of very helpful documents if you're looking for the intersection and what we've heard a lot from LEAs on determining within district Title I allocations in the absence of the NSLP data. So that's all I have for the slide, and we can move on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. So at this time, we would like to open it up to live audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A function to the right of your screen to submit questions, and we will moderate them and look to see, and we'll pose them to the panel and see who potentially has answers. So as you can see, this is a list of everybody that we have on the available to answer your questions. And I thought that we could start sort of with more of a general question in the vein of Title I and alternative forms. So if alternative forms are required for my state, do I have to use school meal applications, or can I use another different type of form, or can I even make my own form?
How do you want to answer this one?
Fatima, were you calling on Todd or on USDA?
I was calling on Todd.
Okay.
But if you guys want to jump in, you guys can definitely go. I know from our perspective, we have had this question come in terms of household applications and creating your own surveys. And
Fatima, feel free to continue. I'm sorry about that feedback.
No worries. No, I was just saying that we have had states come to us and ask if they can create their own surveys in terms of getting this information, and that is possible. And also to echo what I said before, like if states do not have the the Medicaid or census census poverty level data. But Todd is more of the expert on that, and so I'll have him add anything if he's able to. We might be experiencing technical difficulties there.
Todd, I think you might be muted on the phone. This is fun, isn't it? Steve, are you there? All right, well,
I'm here. I can't unmute him myself. He has to do it himself. And I think he's muted on the phone, not the computer, right?
Okay. Well, while we figure that out, does anybody from USDA have anything that they would like to add on this?
Yeah, we'd also like to add that you have to be really careful. Let's say you're operating CEP on a district-wide level. We would never want to have applications that indicate anything about receiving meal benefits if it's not for meal benefits. So if there is an alternate funding source, it could never say something like, you must complete this in order to receive meal benefits, because sometimes those forms are accidentally used. It gets a little complicated when there's a partial implementation of CEP within a district, because then some kids are really filling out applications for school meals and some aren't. And so there just has to be a method in place that parents respectively understand what form they're filling out and for what reason, and the language is clear on there, and that the people processing them in the office understand, this one is for non-meal funding, this one is for education funding, and so forth.
Sorry about the technical issue. I'm trying to jump back in. Can folks hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Just to add to what was said, and I think the point that if a district decides to use its own its own form, for example, for within district Title I allocations, as Fatima was talking about, to replicate what it used to get through the household applications. It would just, as was stated, would want to make it clear that it's doing it for Title I purposes only and not for anything with the meals program. But again, because there's other options available, like just using the adjusted count up by one direct certification count up by 1.6. A lot of times that's not going to be needed for a particular school in terms of ranking its schools to have to go that extra mile and collect its own form. Title I can work really well without having to do that. Because one of the benefits has been discussed the CP is lessening burden on families and not having to complete the form. So there's not any need really with Title I to do that, to add a form in many cases.
Thank you so much, Todd and Fatima and to Jennifer for your answers to that question. So we have another question that is around, I mentioned briefly earlier the Medicaid direct certification request for proposal. Could my friends from USDA elaborate on what that is and what the deadlines are for that?
I'm sorry, Allison, you were breaking up just for a second, but the deadlines for what?
Could you talk about the request for proposals for Medicaid direct certification and the deadlines?
I think someone will be able to address that. Hold on, just give me 1 second.
I can address that question.
Okay, Deborah, you can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's really good to talk with your state agency. There's usually an application deadline posted. It's issued annually. And with the, is this concerning the Medicaid
So for
demonstration
example,
project?
this is a state that they do not have the Medicaid direct certification. Could you talk briefly about what that is and how they could potentially get involved in that?
Yes. Okay. SFAs and schools participating in CEP may participate in the demonstration project to evaluate direct certification with Medicaid. The students identified through Medicaid with an income meeting the 130 or 133% of federal poverty level threshold may be included in the ISP. Usually the RFP is released annually. For additional information on the direct certification pilot, you probably need to, the state agency probably needs to contact their regional office directly.
And I want to add just one thing, that the request for proposals is out, and to start a demonstration project with direct cert with Medicaid, it's if they want to start in July, the applications are due September 30th, 2022. But then, like Deborah said, contacting your state agency that you're interested to do that is important.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. So this is a more broad question about how does one, and this maybe Rob, you could give some insight into this, and maybe Maureen as well, since you were involved at the beginning of this whole CEP process. How, if a school is interested in community eligibility, how does one even get started?
I can help with that. So when I was in Wareham, it was my first school job, and the superintendent and business manager kind of threw me into it. So I had no idea how to do CEP. And basically, running the direct cert files through the state to figure out what your number is. That's the first start. And then, and you can get into the program at 40% ISP, but you've got to figure out, if that's going to work for you in terms of that reimbursement rate that you're going to get back. So there's some calculations you have to do, and depending on the size of the school, like I said, I was in Wareham, there was 2,400 students. So, it was a little challenging. At about 47% is what the first rate, the first ISP I had to deal with, which is about 75 or 6% of the reimbursement rate. So you have to, utilize all the other things that you have at your disposal, like the commodities, entitlement dollars, watching your food cost, making sure that if you're part of a collaborative, what your labor costs, can you do offer versus serve? There's a lot of things you can do to try to, save money, so that if you're not making that gap, if you were just a full paid district. So, but I was able to do it. I made it work. I had some great people, great managers. It was 4 schools, and the numbers worked, and we made some money the first year and a little bit more the next year. So, so it worked out good. Being in New Bedford this last 4 years, it's actually been kind of easy. 13,000 plus students. Breakfast is really the program that makes you a lot of money, because you can, it's a lot of participation, and I didn't have a lot of people working that program. The items are quick, it's in the classroom. So, you're able to get a lot of bang for your buck in that program if you're a bigger district. But I was able to do it in both. So I can gladly, talk to people more about that offline if they want more information about how I did that. But your participation is going to go up when the students are free. You can guarantee that's going to happen. So it just depends on the gap between where you are now and what your estimated participation will be when you go CEP.
Awesome. Thanks for that awesome answer, Rob. We have another question that's sort of talking about, there are definitely various stakeholders involved in the process when you're trying to convince a district or a school that CEP is a good idea, including you know, a superintendent or a principal or the school business officials or even the school board. Maureen, I know you've been working on CEP for a long time. Do you have any suggestions for people who are working with various stakeholders to try to get everybody on board to CEP, to convince everybody it's a good idea?
Sure, and I think this is a way that advocates in the community can be helpful too, because I think the calculation is going to be different for different stakeholders. So for some, it's going to be, you know, you're going to feed more kids, you're going to see your program, you know, the participation in your program go up, and you're also not going to be a debt collector anymore. So you're not going to have to worry about going to your families and asking them for money for reduced price or paid meals, right? And I think on the secondary piece, when you're talking to a business manager or sometimes even the superintendent, it is talking about streamlining efficiencies in programmatic decision making, right? So thinking about how many kids are going to participate and how that's going to help not having to collect all those free and reduced price meal applications, what that's going to look like for your school, and really thinking about calculations in terms of the school nutrition budget and what that's going to look like in terms of the overall budget for the school. So I think that advocates can be really helpful in bringing stakeholders together, connecting you with folks from other districts that have gone through similar issues, really looking at coming and talking to the school board or the superintendent and going through those calculations, using tools like what FRAC has available to go through and say, here's what the grouping might look like if you put these 3 schools together. Here's what it looks like if you do the full district. And then really coming together and saying, you know, the math works. It's right for our school and it's right for our kids, and really bringing all the stakeholders together.
I can only add to what Maureen said, that the other thing too about the stakeholders is that, you know, in the smaller district I had, there was a lot of pushback from the teachers unions about doing breakfast in the classroom. So what I did was I tried to find a couple of teachers who were really good advocates, and I ran it as a pilot first for about 6 to 8 weeks. And then after that pilot, I brought the group together, the teachers and so forth and administrators, and had them talk about the pros and cons. And the ones who were doing the pilot loved it, thought it was great. The kids were getting fed, and that in turn led to the rest of the building wanted to do it. So it was better. It was a better sell that way when you get more people to you know, advocate for you, and maybe start out as a small pilot and not try to do the whole school at the same time. So that's what worked for me. But you know, everyone could have a different approach to how to do it.
Awesome, thank you both. This is another question for the two of you. This from this district who is thinking about, you know, they have some schools in community eligibility and other schools that aren't in community eligibility. How do you communicate to families that, you know, one school in your district may offer free meals and the other doesn't, now that free meals aren't going to be available next year?
Rob, I was going to let you jump in, but I can tell you, like, we had a district here that was very concerned about that. They were concerned if they did CEP in one school and not the rest of the district, that parents would complain. And what they really found was that the students participated more. It helped the budget. It actually helped them expand CEP to additional schools. So really talking almost the way Rob was earlier, which is creating a pilot and saying, like, we want to expand this, but we need to see if it works here first. I think a lot of school districts think it's going to be an issue, and it actually works out better for kids across the board. So while we've heard schools worry about it, we haven't really seen that it has been a problem in the long run, because kids are excited and more kids participate, and it really helps families all throughout the district, and it's helped schools expand to more schools.
Yeah, and I can build on what Maureen said. I mean, I had that in Wareham. I had to stop one school from participating because I was worried that the ISP was going to be really too low to make the program viable. But in the end, you know, the following year, the ISP went up just slightly, but I decided to bring that school in, and I was able to work out with the numbers. You know, the participation goes up, the money was there. I didn't have any debt, so it worked out. So don't get too scared about, you know, being in the high 40s or the low 50s of ISP because, like I said, I was doing it and I made, a significant amount of money in the first couple of years that I could put back into the program, even though I wasn't getting 100% of that paid rate.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for that assurance, both of you. So we have a question for our friends at USDA about what dates to use for your numbers, and can you use different days if your schools are not going to be grouped together when you're determining ISPs and enrollment numbers. If you're grouping at a district level, is it important which day you choose to pull those numbers?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. So really all of the information to determine an ISP has to be representative of April 1st of each year. And that's pretty much in regulation. The only time there would be an exception to that would be, well, this year, because we do have a waiver that's in effect. So basically, a school district can choose to base their data for this year from any time from July 1st, 2021 until June 30th of 2022. And that's just because of the pandemic. But the key here is that it does really need to be the same date. Because you have kids moving around within schools, and so it wouldn't work out if it's a certain date and these kids are in this school and everyone knows that this happens, right? Kids move around between different schools, and then all of a sudden a bunch of kids are in this school and so it needs to be a consistent date. That's really important. And then the other thing too is if there is a big challenge, I'm not sure if this was a district or state that asked this, but the district can reach out to the state. The state can reach out to Food and Nutrition Services at USDA, because there's also another kind of exception that FNS could approve a different date than April 1st, but there really have to be a good reason for it or different. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. And then there's another question more broadly about important dates for CEP for this upcoming school year.
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, we're talking about the flexibilities around CEP dates?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So let's just go over just real quick the CEP dates in general. So on April 15th, state agencies usually notify local educational agencies of district-wide eligibility statuses. And they provide guidance and information to those school districts interested in CEP participation. And then also on April 15th, LEAs are to submit school level eligibility information to their respective state agencies, unless of course the state agency exempts the LEA from that requirement because they already have that data available. So there are two deadlines around April 15th, and we'll move on to the May 1st deadline. So May 1st, state agencies post the LEA district-wide and school level list on their websites. And they also send a link to the Food Nutrition Service about those LEAs that may be eligible to participate in CEP. And then of course we have the June 30th deadline, and that's to elect CEP. So during school year 21, or let's go back actually. Yeah, no. Let's go to school year 21-22. This school year, FNS issued a nationwide waiver using the Families First Coronavirus Response Act to provide a waiver that adjusted these deadlines, and it was applicable to all states that decided to be subject to the waiver, which means if a state wanted to provide flexibility surrounding these deadlines to their districts or their local educational agencies, they could opt in to participate in the nationwide waiver, and that would adjust, like let's talk about the April 1st date. LEAs or schools have to use the April 1st date to calculate their ISPs, and that data should be reflective of what's available around April the 1st. But USDA gave flexibility and provided LEAs and schools to calculate their ISPs using any data between July 1st and June 30th. And we also provide a little bit flexibility around that LEA notification, and that annual deadline was April 15th, but the waiver deadline extended that to June 30th. And then the state agency notification that, states usually notify all the local educational agencies and of district-wide eligibility, that was also extended to June 30th. And then state agency publication, which is usually, the deadline for that's usually May 1st. USDA extended that to June 30th. And then also the date to elect CEP was extended from June 30th to September 30th. And that was for this school year. Now, because the U.S. Department of Agriculture does, the flexibility to issue a nationwide waiver was not extended beyond school year 21-22. So for this new school year, we've been issuing statewide waivers under the National School Lunch Act, which basically provides the same flexibility around these deadlines. So notification deadlines are extended through June 30th, and then the CEP date that schools usually elect to participate in the provision is extended from June 30th to September 30th. A lot of information there, but basically it's just USDA has been providing adjustments to these deadlines to allow more time for both schools and states to calculate ISPs and prepare for CEP implementation, just because we know a lot's been going on. And, there's a lack of data, and summer programs have been operating during COVID. So
it was a lot of information, but a lot of helpful information. So thanks for that, Jeff. And a follow-up question on that. Do you all have an idea of how many states have taken up these waivers?
Yeah, I do. I have a pretty good idea. I think it's probably around 30, but if you circle back to it, I'll give you a more precise number towards the end of the presentation.
Excellent, thank you. And then I have another question for our friends at USDA, and it's around the characteristic study that you all recently published. Could you all talk a little bit about that and what sort of helpful information that was in there?
Sorry, I'm having a little problem coming off mute. There is a study that was released in March 2022, and it is currently posted on the FNS website. This study was designed to provide USDA FNS with information about the overall impact of CEP since its inception in 2014. The study included both an implementation and impact component, and some of the key findings that they found was CEP participation increased both student meal participation and the levels of federal reimbursement. It found that 66% of LEAs participating in CEP elected to participate LEA-wide, and that LEA-wide ISPs was the most important perceived factor in CEP election. And a couple of other things that I found very interesting is that eligible non-participating LEAs indicated that CEP would be more appealing if the factor used to determine meal reimbursement levels were increased. Also, another interesting finding was that financial concerns were the largest barrier to CEP participation for LEAs with lower ISPs. Again, it is listed on the FNS website for anyone to view. So I would invite you to go in and read about it, especially if you're interested in participating in CEP.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Deborah. And we can link to that in our follow-up information. We can include a link to that characteristic study if people are interested in reading. I am going to continue by encouraging people to enter any questions that they may have in the chat and in the Q&A. If you have trouble finding the Q&A function, if you go to the bottom right of your screen, and there's 3 dots and that show more panels, and you should be able to select the Q&A if you haven't been able to enter your question yet. So please submit your questions. we are coming up on time. So I guess in the interest of time, while we're waiting for anybody, any outstanding questions, I would invite anybody to come off and answer the following question. If to anybody who's listening, CEP is such a transformative program. Could you give a 30-second elevator pitch for why you think CEP is beneficial to districts and to schools?
I can start. It just, you're feeding more students. You're making a difference in their lives in terms of getting them ready for their, education and being attentive in school. Breakfast is just a huge thing for them. Your nurse visits will go down. We've seen that pattern in our schools. So there's just so many benefits. I don't really see any drawbacks at all.
I'll go next.
Sorry, Robbie.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, excuse me. I just want to say that CEP participation or implementation in school also eliminates the stigma that's usually attached to free or reduced price statuses or who qualifies for a free meal. And it does also, just for that reason, intend to increase participation. And, also a lot of schools just throw the whole hassle with household applications out the window, which both benefits the families who usually have to fill them out and then return them to the school district, and then the school district or the school has to process those applications and then verify them later, And then also the streamlined meal service just allows for the lunch line to move a lot quicker. You don't have a point of service, you're not making transactions, and it usually provides that student population in that school just more time to actually sit down and eat their healthy school lunch and return to class. So those are some additional benefits.
As we return to normal school operations, we understand that SFAs are going to be facing a lot of challenges, especially with staffing issues. So CEP is ideal for reducing administrative burdens, especially since you don't have to gather and process school meal applications. So that's my pitch.
Thank you so much. Do any of our friends from the Department of Ed want to come in?
I would just add to that if Fatima talked earlier on about kind of the purpose of Title I and improving student achievement, closing achievement gaps, and the things that were just mentioned about supporting students through the meals program and the benefits of CEP. Seems like it all connects.
Absolutely. Well, Maureen, if you have any final closing thoughts that you'd like to share before we close out, I won't force you, but I will open up the floor to you if you have anything that you'd like to add.
I'll just say that I've seen schools all across Wisconsin benefit from CEP. There's no reason any child in the United States goes to school hungry. This is a program that helps schools not only streamline the administration of their school meals programs, but allows all children to eat breakfast and lunch for free. It eliminates school lunch shaming, and it really helps both schools and students succeed. I think we have shown today that it's a program that you can easily get started, and it's something that really helps children in your schools.
Well, I couldn't have said that better myself. So thank you, Maureen, and thank you to everyone who is on our webinar today. We really, really appreciate all of your insight. And I think at this point we can close out. Stephen, if you want to go to the next slide. So thank you all so much for joining us. We are incredibly, incredibly grateful to our incredible panelists and for sharing their expertise, and for everyone joining to get their questions asked and answered. So the recording and resources that have been mentioned throughout this webinar will be shared in a follow-up email with everyone. And in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to me personally via my email, which is on the screen, aperez@frac.org. If you have a question that did not get answered, or you have tomorrow you wake up and you realize that you have a question that you didn't think of today, we're happy to answer and take those questions at FRAC, or to connect you with the right person who is able to answer that question for you. Thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, we'll talk to you soon.